The hum of engines shook the ground, and the air was filled with the acrid stench of diesel smoke and fresh-cut timber as Ethan sprinted down the gravel road toward the lake cabin that had been in his family for 3 generations. His lungs burned with every breath, and his heart pounded against his ribs, not only from a run, but from the dread that settled into his chest as the roof of the cabin buckled under the relentless claw of the bulldozer. Splinters rained like hail, and the sound of cracking beams was like bones snapping under enormous weight. Ethan froze at the edge of the clearing, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he watched years of memories disintegrate before his eyes. The lake reflected the chaos like a cruel mirror, its once serene surface now echoing back the nightmare. He stumbled forward, shouting, but his voice was drowned out by the machinery. Workers in hard hats turned only briefly before returning to their destruction. His mind flooded with images of childhood summers when his father taught him to fish on the dock, when his mother laughed while burning marshmallows by the fire pit, when his younger sister carved her initials into the old oak that stood proud beside the porch. Every memory was being chewed apart and scattered as debris. He reached the cabin steps, though there were no longer steps, only a pile of jagged boards and glass. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened, and his jaw locked as he yelled again to stop. Finally, the engines ceased their growl, and the machines idled. A woman stepped into the silence, her heels clicking on the dirt path, as though she were on polished marble. Margaret Crane, president of the HOA, approached with her head high, and her smile sharp enough to cut. She wore a tailored suit too fine for a demolition site, and oversized sunglasses that reflected Ethan's broken figure. Her voice dripped with false sweetness when she said, "Mr. Cole, you have ignored repeated notices about unpaid fees and structural violations." The board voted unanimously. This property was condemned. Ethan's chest heaved as he forced out words through clenched teeth. "I paid every fee. I have the receipts. You had no right." She tilted her head like a cat playing with a dying mouse. "Receipts. Paper can be forged. Rules are rules. And you clearly cannot afford to play by them." Her words stung more than the dust in his throat. Around him a few neighbors had gathered, some whispering nervously, others watching with quiet satisfaction at the spectacle. Margaret thrived on their attention. She gestured grandly at the ruin behind him as though she were unveiling art. It was an eyesore anyway. The neighborhood deserves better views of the lake. Perhaps a developer will put something tasteful here. Something that increases property value. Ethan felt fire rising in his veins. He stepped toward her holding nothing but raw fury and the memory of his father handing the cabin keys the day he graduated college, saying, "This is yours now, protected." Ethan spat the words. "You forged this. You fabricated everything." She only laughed a sound without warmth that carried across the clearing. "Then take it up with the board. Or the courts. Either way, you will find this community is on my side. You should have learned not to cross me." Ethan's gaze swept the faces around him. Some neighbors looked away, ashamed, others smirked, enjoying the downfall of someone they envied for the lakeside cabin. He realized then that reason would not pierce the armor Margaret had built from arrogance and manipulation. She thrived on crushing dissenters and making examples. She had chosen him because his cabin was valuable land, and because she believed he was powerless. His fists trembled at his sides as he fought the urge to scream or swing. Instead, he swallowed the anger, letting it burn into something sharper, colder. Margaret leaned close enough that he could smell her perfume, cloying and suffocating. She whispered so only he could hear. "The sooner you accept defeat, the sooner you can crawl back to whatever shack you came from." She stepped back, raising her voice for the crowd. "This matter is closed." She turned briskly, her heels clicking again as she dismissed him like trash. The engines roared back to life, and the bulldozer rammed deeper into what was left of the cabin. Ethan stood rooted to the earth, his eyes watering not from dust, but from rage. His family legacy was gone, his memories ground into rubble at the command of a woman drunk on power. He wanted to fight her here and now, but he knew fists would not win, not against someone who was behind rules, and paperwork twisted to her advantage. He turned slowly toward the lake, breathing in the scent of sawdust, smoke, and gasoline. His reflection stared back at him, broken, but alive. As the machine clawed down the final wall, Ethan whispered under his breath, a vow carried only to the still waters. "You picked the wrong family." Ethan sat at his kitchen table long after nightfall. The receipts spread before him like a battlefield of ink, and numbers, each one proof that he had paid every single HOA fee. The lamp above flickered, casting shadows that seemed to mock his helplessness. His hands trembled not from doubt, but from fury at the thought that Margaret had stood on the ruins of his family's cabin and laughed while he begged her to stop. He gathered the papers into a neat stack, slid them into a folder, and swore that the next time they met he would not be humiliated. His phone buzzed with messages from neighbors, some offering empty condolences, others suggesting he let it go. He deleted them all. He was not ready to forgive, and he was not ready to forget. By the end of the week, Ethan walked into the HOA meeting hall. The room smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, the kind of place where decisions were made under fluorescent lights that stripped away warmth. The long table at the front gleamed with polished wood, and behind it sat the board members, stiff and self-important. At the center, Margaret sat like a queen on her throne, her pearl necklace glinting under the lights, her smile thin and cruel. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Ethan took his seat, folder clutched tightly against his chest. His pulse hammered with each tick of the clock until the meeting was called to order. When Margaret announced that community concerns would be heard, Ethan rose to his feet. His voice shook at first, but grew steady as he laid out the receipts one by one across the table. He showed payment confirmations, bank statements, even copies of emails where HOA staff had acknowledged his payments. Gasps spread through the room. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw cracks in Margaret's armor, but she leaned back, eyes glinting with amusement. She plucked one receipt between her manicured fingers, holding it up for all to see. "What an interesting collection of papers," she said with feigned curiosity. "Unfortunately, these do not match our official records. And as we all know, only our records are binding." A ripple of laughter spread from her allies on the board. Ethan's face burned red. He pointed to the numbers, his voice louder now. "These are official bank transactions. You cannot dismiss them." Margaret tilted her head, letting the silence build. Then she produced glossy photos from a folder of her own. They showed the cabin's porch sagging, the dock tilting, and weeds sprouting through cracks. But Ethan knew the images had been altered. Shadows did not match, angles were distorted. Still, the neighbors gasped at the sight. Margaret's lips curled in triumph. "Not only were your fees delinquent, but your property was neglected, unsafe, an embarrassment to this community. We had no choice." Ethan felt the room turn against him. Neighbors who once fished on his dock now muttered words like irresponsible and liar. He tried to protest, but Margaret raised a hand, silencing him. "This board operates with authority granted by the covenant. Not even the police will interfere. You had your chance, Mr. Cole. The matter is closed." Her voice was final, each word a nail in his coffin. His throat tightened as he looked around, hoping for a single ally, but found only downcast eyes or satisfied smirks. His knees felt weak, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath him. He gathered his papers, shoving them back into the folder, his movements sharp and angry. Margaret smirked as if savoring his collapse. He turned to leave, but at the door he stopped. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the murmur of voices swelled behind him. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and let the humiliation burn into resolve. Margaret believed she had crushed him. She believed he was powerless. But she was wrong. He stepped outside into the night air, the chill biting at his skin. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over a contact he had not called in months. He thought of his sister Sarah, her sharp eyes, her steady voice, the way she never let injustice stand. He thought of his cousin James, meticulous, with numbers, able to unravel financial knots that others could not see. He thought of his mother, who had spent decades on the bench commanding courtrooms with authority Margaret could only pretend to wield. A family bound by blood and by law. Ethan pressed the call button. When Sarah answered, her voice was crisp as ever. "Ethan, it's late. What's wrong?" He swallowed hard, his voice low but steady. "They tore down the cabin. Margaret Crane forged it all. I need help." There was a pause and a slow, deliberate reply. "Tell me everything." As he spoke, pacing beneath the dark sky, he felt the weight lifting slightly with each detail. Sarah's silence was not indifference, it was calculation. When he finished, she exhaled. "She thinks she is untouchable. That makes her sloppy. You are not alone in this. We will handle it the right way." Ethan closed his eyes, relief washing through him, but also something darker, determination. He knew Margaret had declared war. She thought it was over, but the truth was it had just begun. Ethan met Sarah the next morning at a quiet diner on the edge of town. The clink of cups and low murmur of conversation could not soften the sharp edge in her eyes as she listened to him retell the events in detail. She wore a simple jacket, her badge hidden, but her presence commanding. When he finished, she folded her hands on the table, her tone even but carrying weight. She believes she is above the law. That arrogance is our opening. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and rough. She destroyed everything. I want her exposed. I want her to pay. Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then we will gather proof. We do not move without it. That night, they sat together with James, who had driven in from the city. James carried stacks of files tucked under his arm, his glasses sliding down his nose as he flipped them open on Ethan's dining table. Numbers sprawled across spreadsheets, bank transfers, suspicious withdrawals. His voice was calm, almost attached, as he explained. She has been siphoning funds. HOA dues are not going where they should. I see patterns of embezzlement. She launders through shell accounts. Ethan stared at the figures, lines of deception spreading like a web. James pushed one page forward, tapping it with precision. Here, offshore routing. She is stealing from her own community. Ethan felt both fury and grim satisfaction. Margaret had accused him of neglect while lining her pockets with stolen money. Sarah leaned back, crossing her arms. With this we have leverage. But evidence alone is not enough. She manipulates perception. We need to turn the neighborhood against her. People must see the truth, not just hear it. Ethan's eyes narrowed as a memory of the doctor photograph seared his mind. She humiliated me in public. That is where she will fall. The following days blurred into long hours of planning. Sarah used her contacts, discreetly pulling fragments of legal documents, permits, and communications between Margaret and local developers. James traced payments that flowed like poison rivers into hidden accounts. Ethan worked tirelessly gathering testimonies from neighbors who had also suffered sudden fines, baseless threats, and suspicious property inspections. At first, they were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. But when Ethan showed them evidence, their voices strengthened, their anger rising against the woman who had ruled through fear. Late one evening, Sarah set her phone on the table, playing a video clip. It showed Margaret at the demolition site smirking as she mocked Ethan, captured on a neighbor's hidden camera. Dust swirled in the air, her voice sharp and cruel. Ethan felt the old rage surge through him, but this time it was tempered with purpose. Sarah spoke firmly. We release this. Pair it with records and testimonies. Let her own arrogance condemn her. The video spread faster than they expected. Within hours, it climbed across social platforms, neighbors sharing it beyond the community, strangers weighing in with outrage. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Hashtag ignorant. Hashtag justice for the cabin. Comments poured in, mocking her smile, calling for her resignation, demanding accountability. Margaret had always thrived on control, but now the spotlight turned harsh and unrelenting. Ethan watched the tide shift in real time, the very audience she once commanded now jeering at her downfall. Margaret responded with venomous statements, calling the footage fake, calling Ethan a liar once more. But her denials only fanned the flames. Journalists sniffed around the story, hungry for scandal. A local news van appeared at the gates of the community, capturing interviews from residents who spoke cautiously at first, then boldly as they saw the swelling wave of support. Margaret could not silence them all. For the first time, her throne trembled. Still, Sarah insisted they move carefully. Public anger is pressure, but law is a hammer. We need the hammer. James nodded, sliding a fresh stack of papers across the table. I traced the missing funds to a Cayman account. More than $200,000 diverted. That is not mismanagement. That is fraud. Ethan's chest tightened with grim satisfaction. Then we bring it down on her head. They set the stage for the next HOA meeting. Ethan imagined her walking in, still convinced of her dominance, unaware of the trap closing around her. He pictured the receipts projected on the wall, the bank statements, the testimonies, and finally Sarah revealing her badge in front of them all. The thought steadied him, fueled him. For weeks he had felt powerless, but now each detail was a stone laid into the foundation of her fall. On the night before the meeting, Ethan stood at the shore where his cabin once stood. The lake glimmered beneath the moonlight's silent witness to his vow. He breathed deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs. Behind him the wind stirred the scattered remnants of his family's legacy, but before him stretched the promise of justice. He whispered into the darkness, "Tomorrow she learns who she crossed." The hall was crowded, the air buzzing with restless voices, as neighbors filled every chair, their curiosity sharpened by the storm of gossip and the viral videos that had spread through the community. The board members sat stiffly at the long table, while Margaret Crane presided in her usual place, her pearl necklace gleaming and her lips curled in disdain. She tapped her gavel, the sound echoing off the walls, commanding silence. Ethan stood near the back, his folder tucked under his arm, his pulse steady for the first time since the cabin had been reduced to rubble. Tonight would not be like the last meeting tonight. The truth would not be buried beneath her lies. Margaret's voice rang through the room, smooth and cutting, as she declared the session open. She wasted no time launching into a monologue about order and responsibility and the importance of respecting authority. Her words slithered across the crowd as she painted herself a guardian of community standards. Some nodded along, others shifted uneasily, knowing what had come to light since her last display of power. Ethan listened without speaking, waiting for his moment. When she opened the floor for concerns, Ethan rose. The shuffle of bodies and sudden quiet that fell across the hall gave weight to his presence. Margaret's eyes narrowed, the practiced smile faltering just slightly as he walked forward. He placed his folder on the table and spread the documents across its polished surface, the receipts, the bank statements, the evidence she had dismissed weeks earlier. His voice rang clear, steady with conviction. "You said I never paid my fees. These records prove otherwise. You said my cabin was unsafe. Yet these images were altered. You said I was a liar. But tonight you will see who has been lying." Margaret let out a short, sharp laugh, trying to seize control. "More theatrics, Mr. Cole. No matter how many forged papers you wave around the board, will not be fooled. This matter has been settled." Ethan's gaze did not waver. He gestured to a projector that flickered to life, showing the viral footage of the demolition. Gasps rose from the crowd as Margaret's own voice filled the hall, her mocking tone played back without mercy. Her smirk from that day now looked grotesque, magnified on the screen. Neighbors shifted, whispering, some outright jeering. Margaret slammed her hand against the table, shouting for order. But Ethan did not flinch. Sarah stepped forward from the crowd, her movements deliberate, her badge flashing under the lights. A wave of shock rippled through the audience as she announced her name, her rank, her jurisdiction. This is no longer an HOA dispute. This is an investigation into fraud and abuse of power. Murmurs exploded around the hall. Margaret froze, her face draining of color, before she forced a sneer. "This is absurd. You cannot intimidate me with theatrics." James emerged next, his arms full of files, his voice calm and cutting as he laid out the financial trail of embezzlement. Every dollar traced, every shell account exposed. Numbers flashed on the screen, undeniable proof of theft. The audience erupted in outrage, neighbors rising from their seats, shouting demands for her resignation. Margaret's composure cracked, her voice rising shrill, as she denied everything, calling it fabrications, lies, conspiracies. But the more she spoke, the weaker she sounded, the less anyone believed her. The doors at the back opened, and federal agents entered, their footsteps heavy, their expression severe. Margaret stumbled back, her hands trembling as they presented a warrant. The room was chaos, neighbors cheering, others recording on their phones, capturing every second. Margaret shrieked, clawing at the table, as the agents seized her arms. "You cannot do this. I am the president. I make the rules here," she screamed. Ethan stepped closer, his voice calm like steel. "Not anymore." As she was dragged from the hall, kicking and cursing, the neighbors erupted in applause. Some clapped with relief, others with fury, released at last. Ethan stood in the center, the weight of humiliation lifted, replaced by vindication. His eyes found the faces of those who had once turned away, now looking to him with gratitude and respect. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice low. "It is done. She will never touch another family again." The following week, Ethan returned to the lakeshore where only rubble remained. The air was still the water, reflecting the sky in calm silence. Yet he no longer saw only loss. Neighbors had gathered behind him, bringing tools, timber, and determination. One by one, they offered help to rebuild, to restore what Margaret had tried to erase. Ethan's chest tightened not with grief, but with pride. His family stood beside him, Sarah James's mother, all steady and strong. Together they would raise the cabin again, piece by piece. As they worked, laughter and conversation mingling with the hammering of nails, Ethan paused, gazing out over the lake. A breeze stirred the water, carrying away the final remnants of despair. His phone buzzed with another viral, post a meme of Margaret in handcuffs, captioned with brutal humor. HOA rules do not apply in federal prison. Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. For the first time in weeks, the sound carried no bitterness, only relief. He whispered under his breath words meant for the memory of his father and for himself. Justice served.